Hi and welcome to Emsi's Scottish Conference, Colleges at the Heart of Scotland's Skills Development. Thank you for joining us for this first session, which is hosted by Emsi's FE Account Director, Ben Owen. He will also be joined by Duncan Brown, who's Emsi's Senior Economist. If you have any questions during the course of this presentation, please put them in the question box on the control panel, and we'll endeavour to get back to those at the end of the presentation. You will be receiving a follow-up email with the recordings and slides from today's presentation, so keep your eyes open for that. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Ben. Good morning, Ben.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Good morning to you, and good morning to Duncan as well. We're delighted to be joined by our Senior Economist. Good morning, Duncan.
How are you?
Good, thank you. Good. So this is session one. So we've got two sessions this week in terms of our Scottish conferences. So we've got Duncan's insight into what the Scottish labour market looks like, and particularly over the last 12 months, which has obviously been a very challenging time. So we've got some exciting data to be looking at today from Duncan. And then session number two is at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, and that will be a round table session, a virtual roundtable session, which I'll be hosting again. And we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Simon Hewitt, the Principal and Chief Exec of Dundee and Angus College, Dorothy Leslie, the VP for Academic Strategy at Fife College, and John Berglass, the Vice Principal at Edinburgh College. And hosting that will be our Managing Director, Andy Derman. We'll be leading some questions and answers there, again, in terms of the challenges moving forward and the opportunities for colleges in the next 12, 18 and 24 months. So without further ado, I will hand over to Duncan Brown, our Senior Economist, to take you through the session this morning.
Thanks, Ben. So I've got a whole bunch of slides with lots of charts to talk to you about, first of all, the Scottish labour market in what's been, as we all know, an eventful year, more eventful than we either wanted or anticipated, and then also to talk about some of the wider kind of trends that will go on over the sort of the 2020s and will have big implications for how the labour market unfolds during that time. So let's start with the labour market, and just to get some background, I thought it'd be good to kind of just establish some facts about the Scottish economy and how it sits compared to the rest of the UK, and how it's changed over time before the sort of the rather volatile period of the past 12 months has come in. And so we start off with this chart, which gives the number of jobs in each of the sort of the headline industries in Scotland, and the red dots are if the UK pattern of jobs was applied to the number of jobs in Scotland, what would it look like? So it allows us to compare what Scotland looks like to the rest of the UK, and they're ranked in terms of the sort of the relative distance between the red dot and the green bar, where the green bar is Scotland. And so you can see mining and quarrying right at the top there, where the red dot is really a long way back from the green bar, and that's because of the oil and gas sector around Aberdeen, of course. And you can see some of the other industries that are large are not always any different in Scotland than elsewhere. So if you sort of move up from the bottom, the sort of the first really big bar you come to is wholesale and retail trade, and there's lots of jobs in it. There's sort of more than 1/3 jobs in wholesale and retail trade, but actually that's fewer than you get at the UK-wide level. It's just a very labour-intensive sector. And then the next big one is human health and social work activities, which is over 400,000 jobs. So it's a big sector, and it is bigger in Scotland than it is in the UK, probably partly reflective of the fact that Scotland has its own distinct NHS. But again, it's not sort of the raw size of it is not always the best indicator of how sort of distinctive that is. Some of the other ones are larger than the sort of UK pattern suggests, include, if I can find my mouse pointer, where's my mouse pointer gone? The problem when you have multiple screens is that you lose your mouse pointer sometimes. Oh, well, there you go. And so you can see agriculture, forestry and fishing up there, but also public admin and defence and compulsory social security. So, you know, as it says there, At the top, it's the Scottish economy is strong in mining and quarrying, farming and government, but then at the bottom end you see things like information and communication, professional, scientific and technical, and then a few up from there, manufacturing, where Scotland has a lower profile in terms of jobs than the rest of the UK. There we go. Got my mouse pointer back. So we can also look at it through a different lens, which is occupations. Now, occupations are distinct from industries because industries are about workplaces that people work in. You have a manufacturing workplace, but it can have lots of different workers in it. It can have finance people, it can have factory workers, it can have managers. Whereas occupations take place at the job level. They're about the jobs that individuals do. And so if we look across them, and again, the red dots take the same role, we can see that in Scotland, as in the whole UK, professional occupations are sort of leading, and they're slightly stronger in Scotland than elsewhere. What you also see, and I managed to have the wrong title on that one because it's slightly misleading there, but you also see down at the bottom there things like process and plant and machine operatives. So again, the factory workers low, which reflects the sort of the low manufacturing size in Scotland, and managers, directors and senior officials are fewer in number, which may be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your view of management, I guess. So yeah, so a good mix of skills there. And so then if we, there we go. So then if we look at the change in jobs across those different occupation groups, this is from 2015 to 2020. So it gives you a sense of the sort of the recent trend there. And what you see is that sort of the technical, admin and professional jobs have really led the job creation in Scotland over that 5-year period. So you can see that between those three groups there at the top, you've got, what is that, about 45,000 jobs being created net. Over that 5 years, adding managers, directors and senior officials, that's another 4,000. So it takes you to sort of around the 50,000 jobs created mark. Whereas if you look at the bottom end, there's actually been a decline in skilled trades, which reflects the picture across the UK. Skilled trades have been long in decline, relatively speaking, losing about 8,000 jobs in Scotland. And possibly the more interesting one is sales and customer service occupations, which before COVID had actually been growing across the whole UK, but declined by a few percentage points in Scotland over that time period. So it's quite a sort of an interesting difference in Scotland. Another way of looking at sort of the change in the economy over that same time period between 2015 and 2020 is to look at it across the local authorities in Scotland, to just sort of see across the different council areas the variation. And you can see there's quite a sort of a large difference, really. So as it says on the sub heading there, East Lothian had the fastest jobs growth over those 5 years, adding more than 14% of jobs, whereas Shetland fell by 14%. But that's not just an island story, because Orkney increased by nearly 12%. So it's quite a sort of a strong mix there. One of the really interesting sides of it, of course, is around the Aberdeen area in the northeast of Scotland there, which has actually seen a sort of a pretty strong fall in jobs over that 5 years, reflecting a sort of some longer term shifts which have affected the oil and gas sector in that part of Scotland's economy, which of course over the past kind of 40 odd years has been a real powerhouse within the Scottish economy. So that's quite an interesting dimension, really. So then something happened, as we all know, just over a year ago. In late March, it became clear that the sort of the virus that we've been hearing these kind of rather obscure news reports about from China had actually reached our shores and was beginning to actually have a real effect in terms of hospital capacity and then sadly fatalities as well. And so that led to unprecedented measures being taken to really shut down society and economy in an attempt to mitigate the impacts of COVID, with some degree of success, not as successful as other countries, but there was some there. First of all, over the next few slides, I'm going to take you through the sort of the consequences of that first period, because it's important to sort of bear in mind that if I went back to this time last year, like most people, I think, I had pretty bleak expectations about our economic future. And as we'll come to, actually, we've done a lot better than those expectations suggest. And so if I start off by just looking at our job postings data. So job postings are useful because a lot of labour market data takes a long while to come through. So the headline unemployment data that you see on the news these days is actually a couple of months old by the time we get it. And in terms of more specifics about what kinds of jobs or what kinds of areas are being affected, it can take even longer than that. Some of the data doesn't come through till 6 months later or more. So job postings data, which we track on the internet every day, is really quite a powerful resource in this respect, because we can find out what was happening 2 days ago. And so early in the sort of the coronavirus period, we were able to really just see this happening in real time. And I've got the Scottish trend here. It should be said that most parts of the UK were fairly similarly affected. London was worse affected because London's a very high turnover labour market. But the rest of the UK tends to be fairly similar in these trends because, of course, everywhere was being affected by COVID. And so, other than a slight difference in industry mix here or there, it's not so different. And so this is weekly data from the start of 2020, and it goes to the summer. And what you see is that sort of around that kind of February, March period, slightly before the announcement of a national lockdown, there was this kind of beginning to sort of drive down. And then once a lockdown happened in late March, that became a headlong dive down. And so what you see is that the trend basically fell about 55% from February to sort of June time. And so a real collapse in labour market demand, a very, like nothing we've ever seen before. I mean, job postings data is relatively new. We've been collecting it since 2016. There are some sources that you can get that go a few further years back, but not many. And so we didn't see it in the last recession. But my guess is, even if you did have it there, knowing what we know about the way that that worked, is that the sort of the labour market effects probably took it a full year before they really gathered pace. And so to see this in basically 2 months, more than half of recruitment demand disappearing, was really quite striking and quite a scary prospect at the time as well. And this is an important part of the story that I'm going to come on to now, because that change was different for different industries. And you can see at the top there, for rather understandable reasons, health and social work actually in Scotland, you see that it sort of mildly increased in terms of the number of job postings. This is comparing June with February. And so, and as you can imagine, we needed people in our health and social care sector like we had rarely needed them before, so it's quite no surprise that the recruitment demand held up there. But then at the opposite extreme there, you've got the accommodation and food service activities sector. So this is hotels and restaurants and pubs, and more than 80% of recruitment demand disappeared in a few short months. More than 3,000 job postings in a month have just disappeared. And you can see that most industries were sort of, more than a third down. Even things like information and communication, which can be done mostly at home, and professional, scientific and technical activities, a lot of those can be done from home as well. The recruitment demand still fell off because at that time we were all concerned about whether the economy was going to really be so badly damaged that even if you can carry on doing your work from home, and some of us had questions about how well we could do that, but even those that could work from home, we were still worried about whether we'd be able to, because whether there'd be the demand there to do it. And if you're in the public sector, whether the demands of fighting COVID on the healthcare side would mean that there was no money for anything else. And it should be said that the government took quite strong steps at UK and Scottish level to sort of mitigate those impacts and to sort of reassure public services that the money was available and would continue, and through for the private sector for furlough as well. And one of the interesting things, as we'll come on to in a moment, is that actually these changes in the sort of the surface level of demand, which is what you get from recruitment advertising and job postings, didn't really translate through so far into huge swings in job numbers in these industries, which means to some extent those interventions did work. In terms of those interventions, though, it's quite useful to get a sense of how Scotland was positioned in terms of the industries that were most affected. And so what we have got here on the left-hand side is a measure of the risk of jobs from any of these industries being put into furlough. And so you can see at the top there, and this is on the basis of the latest available data, that still around, nearly 50% of jobs are in accommodation and food service activities have used furlough of late, whereas at the opposite extreme, public administration and defence, right down near the bottom, hardly any jobs there are being furloughed now, because most of them are considered as essential workers, and most of them can be done either in a socially distanced way or from home. And along the x-axis here, we have the location quotient for Scotland. So if you're not familiar, the location quotient is an index which says how specialised is Scotland compared to the wider UK in terms of this industry. And it basically takes the ratio of the share of jobs in Scotland to the share of jobs in the UK. And so you can see far out there on the right-hand side is mining and quarrying, which, as I said earlier, includes the oil and gas sector. And so Scotland has more than 6 times the number of jobs in that sector as the rest of the UK does, and so its location quotient is over 6. Whereas the black line going vertically there is 1, and an industry which was on that line has the same share of jobs in Scotland as the share of jobs in the UK. And so you can see that actually a lot of Scotland's strongest industries, like mining and quarrying, but also things like public admin and defence down there, electricity, gas, steam and air conditioning supply, human health and social work, are all really low in terms of their furlough use. So actually Scotland was better positioned in some of its leading industries than some parts of the UK were. The exceptions to that is right at the top there with accommodation and food service activities, where Scotland has a moderate specialism. And of course, we know that the sort of the tourist sector in Scotland is really important, especially in some of the rural areas, but also in the sort of the larger cities as well. And arts, entertainment and recreation, again, a sort of a moderate degree of specialism. And so it's kind of a mix between the sort of, a lot of the strongest specialisms are really well protected against COVID, because a lot of them are essential workers. You think about public admin and defence, you think about agriculture, forestry and fishing, and human health and social work. They're really essential workers, but also even where they're not, like with public admin and defence, there's the possibility of doing a lot of it in a socially distanced way. And then mining and quarrying at the far side there is quite an interesting one, where some of the work can be done in a socially distanced way, some of it can't. The sort of the interesting additional dimension with mining and quarrying, which has really changed in the time since the first quarter that we were sort of seeing the effects of COVID, is that at that point in time, you may remember there were stories about how far oil prices had fallen. And that was because there was this general fear that we were going to go into a bit of a global slump, because COVID was going to sort of demolish economies across the sort of the world. Luckily, this is one of those occasions where we really can say luckily, it's not really come to that. And so actually sort of the global economic picture, although it was bad last year because we did turn off a lot of economic activity, the future prospect is looking a lot better than it was then. Not yet to the point where we thought it was going to be before COVID arrived, but it is looking a lot better. And so again, the sort of the initial impact can often be worse than it later turned out to be. So just one last point on this initial kind of impact of COVID, and that's where we use our job postings data to really look about the change in the share of postings for different skills to see which ones have risen and which ones have fallen. And sort of if we start on the right hand side here, these are the skills that rose in importance. So we can see there with nursing right at the top that it went up by 2 percentage points in terms of the share of postings that were asking for these skills. And you look down that list, and most of them are health and care related. You've got nursing, personal care, mental health. You've got learning disabilities in there, pharmaceuticals, social work, physical therapy, primary care, home care, psychology, and so on. And then there's the odd other one that's quite interesting in there, like cooking. Well, of course, actually, sort of, those kinds of jobs were going to hold up, and because they are really important, that we continue to provide catering for certain kinds of environment in terms of care homes and so on, if not others. But on the left-hand side, we've got the fall in other kinds of skills that really were hit hard. And so right at the bottom there, you can see restaurant operation, which really got hit hard. So it's when it says it's fallen by 1.2%, that's 1.2% of all postings. Restaurant operation was basically wiped out as a skill in demand in that time. But also what's interesting here is how the commercial skills really creep in there. So you've got selling techniques and customer experience and business development and sales management and booking of sales. That's because actually the sort of the economic prospects weren't looking bright. So everybody was looking to consolidate and hunker down at that point. And then again, you see oil and gas there getting hit hard in that first period because there's a bit of a freeze on oil prices had fallen. And so that was the situation that we got to by the summer of last year, where we'd really been hit hard. And that was the point at which we began to sort of lift some of the lockdown restrictions slowly at first. And so actually, we started to go into some degree of recovery. And you can see that that carried on well into the autumn, actually. So this chart continues the weekly job postings, and that sort of lower black horizontal line is the sort of the bottom, where it was 55% below the February level, and the top black line is the February level. So it gives you a sense that actually by now, you can see on the right hand side that we're actually around the level that we were in February last year before the coronavirus hit. So actually we're in a much better place than we thought we would be back in last summer. We're getting back to normal on recruitment demand side. And the good thing is at the same time is that at UK level now, we're seeing that unemployment is beginning to fall. In Scotland, it's not yet falling, but it hasn't risen as much as we might have expected. It's gone from 3.8% in February last year to 4.5% in February this year. So an increase, but not nearly the kinds of increases we were expecting by now. We were probably expecting to be at around the sort of 7 or 8%, and a lot of countries have seen those levels. So overall, the labour market picture is looking a lot better. But the other thing to bear in mind on this chart is that you can see that further dip after Christmas, and that's of course as we entered into the full lockdown at the start of this year. And there's a really big hit again to the labour market, but you can see it didn't go nearly so far down as it did back in the second quarter of last year. And that's because in that second quarter of last year, what we had was the sort of the production industries, manufacturing, construction, and all of that really sort of getting hit, really hard and just closing down. Whereas this time around, they found ways of carrying on working in a socially distanced way. And that's carried on even through this lockdown. So that's a big change, and that's held up the economy much better. And this chart lays out those different industries again. And on the x-axis here, we've got the sort of the change from a year before for the first lockdown, and on the y-axis for the second lockdown, so the last few months compared to the same period last year. And so we can see those industries that are in the top right quadrant are those which actually held up better than average across both lockdowns. So health and social work, education, and public administration and defence have been less affected throughout, and that's because they're the kind of the essential worker industries. The really interesting category are these ones on the top left, which got hit really hard in the first lockdown. But then in the second lockdown, they bounced back and actually have seen really strong growth. So you look at construction, agriculture, forestry, and fishing. They've had more job postings in the past few months than they did a year before. So they've been playing catch up effectively. And then these ones in the bottom left are the ones that we worry about. And accommodation and food services way down there, where they've been hit hard in the first lockdown and they stayed hit hard since. And wholesale and retail trade is similar, not as badly affected as accommodation and food service, but still quite badly affected. And then you've got those ones on the borderline on the left, so arts, entertainment and recreation, professional, scientific and technical, finance and insurance, and mining and quarrying, which were hit harder in the first lockdown, but haven't quite sort of come back in the second lockdown as we might have hoped. They're a lot better than they were in the first one, but they've still got some room to make up. And then we have this one again for the skills, but comparing it to June last year to March this year. And we can see that the skills that have bounced back are not quite the ones that went down in the first place. So actually, the really interesting one there is PPE, which is second, which is still holding up really well, still an important part of skills demand. But what you can see is some of those commercial skills coming back, like business development, but also a lot of these digital skills as we're adapting to working from home, or online becomes a more important way of doing business. So you've got agile methodology in there, you've got cybersecurity, customer relationship management, and Amazon Web Services. And then on the left-hand side, compared to June last year, we have had a falling back in some of these healthcare skills, nursing, and physical therapy and so on. And it's not so much that they've actually fallen in absolute terms, it's that other job postings have grown around them. So they've declined in importance rather than declined absolutely. So, and yet that again is a good sign that we're getting back to some degree of normality. So just a few thoughts to conclude really on sort of the normal that we return to when we talk about returning to normal, and really just to talk about some big disruptions that are going on around us. I'm going to talk about technology, trade and migration here really. I'm going to start with technology. And so these two charts are quite useful because they go back a long way. They go back 100 years nearly. They don't get quite to the current year. And so the chart at the top is the typical weekly hours that people have done at work. And you can see that if you go back to the pre-war period, somebody who went to work typically worked more than 45 hours a week. Whereas now the average person works fewer than 35 hours a week because we've got a lot of part-time workers. And so you can see that actually over time, the average amount of hours that a person does has declined quite significantly, especially sort of in that post-war era. But then on that chart at the bottom, you've got the total number of hours worked across all people in the economy. And you can see that that doesn't move in the same way. You can see that obviously it spiked in the war for rather good reasons, and then it declined for a sort of a long period through that post-war era. But then this period since 1980, you can see that it's actually grown, and we're now back to the levels that we saw in the 50s, even though the average number of working hours has fallen. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but it mainly relates to having more people in the workforce. So first of all, more women in the workforce, which started sort of in the 60s and 70s, especially in earnest. But then also more migrants, and this is the period, especially since the late 90s, where the number of women in the workforce began to sort of slow down its growth, and so you've actually had migration driving it. And so the reason why I say this is we talk a lot about automation and technology change, but what you actually can see is there's more work by people than there's been almost ever before, with the exception of World War II. So that's quite an interesting paradox really, that we talk more about technology replacing people now than ever, and yet we've got more people working and more hours in total than we've really been used to before. So here's another chart, and this tells a sort of another side of the story. This is about manufacturing, and this data goes back to 1948. And so it's not a surprise, and we can see the effects in the data for Scotland that we were looking at earlier, that manufacturing employment has fallen a lot in that time. So it's now, this is UK level data, but it's now around 2/3 down compared to the level it was in 1948, and even further down compared to the levels it got to in the 60s. And yet at the same time, the black line there is output, the value of the goods that manufacturing has produced in the UK. And you can see that that hasn't really fallen as much. It's gone up and down a bit, but it's actually maintained its hold. And so actually the average manufacturing worker is producing far more in value of goods than they did before, around 3 times on this basis. And you can sort of see actually more like 4 times. And this purple line is productivity, and that's set to the most recent year on this data. And you can see that productivity has just gone up and up and up. And so what's happened is that we're using a lot less labor in manufacturing, but we're delivering more than we used to back in the 40s and 50s in terms of value. And so and that's the power of technology. That technology has allowed us to have a much smaller manufacturing workforce delivering more than we used to, and similar compared to recent decades in terms of the value of the manufactured goods that we produce. Because of course, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, a lot of manufactured goods were relatively low value, whereas now we produce a lot fewer of them, but they're things like Rolls-Royce cars and aero engines and things like that that are actually really high value goods. So this is across the whole economy, and this tells us sort of a similar a similar story to that, but a bit more besides. And these are sort of the annual growth of 3 different metrics. And so you've got capital stock per worker. And so when we talk about capital, it's all the machines and the computers and the physical structures in the economy that allow people to do their jobs. Output per worker is what we call GDP per worker. It's the value of the goods and services that they produce. And then employment is hopefully fairly self-explanatory. And what you can see here is that the relationship between these 3 is actually quite a sort of a complex one, and it isn't as simple as if you have more machinery, capital stock, you have fewer workers, because there are times when capital stock's really gone up a lot and employment has fallen. And so if you look at the early 90s, you can see that, where we had sort of a booming investment in the very late 80s, and then a fall off in employment, and so capital stock per worker seemed to be replacing workers to some extent. But if you look at this period on the right-hand side of the chart, in the sort of the 2000s and 2010s, you see capital stock per worker, in a time when we've been talking about technology more than ever, has actually been really slow, and yet employment growth has been pretty high. And so actually you can see that for all that we talk more about automation now, we've actually been shifting our economy to become relatively more labour intensive in its growth path than we used to. And so I say all this partly to just sort of push back against the narrative that technology only goes one way. That actually there's sort of good evidence that in the past 2 decades, some of our industries, and we can pick on some of them in particular, like the sort of the food production industry, have actually become relatively less technology and capital intensive than they've become labour intensive. And partly that's because of the availability of migrant labour supply that's really driven that, especially in sort of parts of England. You see that a lot. So this is the sort of the underlying point, that none of the trends that we talk about here with technology, trade and migration are just a given. And so if we think through them in turn, technology innovation itself is highly unpredictable. And we know this sometimes because we, 15 years ago, none of us had a smartphone, and now we can't live without them, literally for a few minutes at a time. And so, it's highly unpredictable. But on the other hand, technology innovation sometimes disappoints us. We haven't yet got flying cars, to use a really pejorative example, but it's also, I mean, I can pick on an example where we've moved away from technology innovation, which is the car washing industry. There are fewer mechanical car washes in this country now than there were 20 years ago, a lot fewer. Something like 2/3 fewer, I think it is. And that's because the availability of labour to do the job instead. Even when technology arrives, it takes a long time for it to be adopted into use. The first computer was an analog machine that the ancient Greeks produced, but they did it really as a sort of a let's see what we can do exercise, and the technology was never applied in any way. It was just there. And so sort of then we get to the 19th century and computers start to be played around with, but it's only really in the past kind of 50 years that we started to bring them into our economy. And so the economics still matters. Having a way of using technology is really important. And if it's competed with against other goods and services produced elsewhere or by available workers, then that can change our adoption of technology. Uncertainties. I did this slide before 2021 and I forgot to update that one bullet point there. We don't even know trading arrangements for 2021. We actually do now, although there have been some hiccups there. But with Brexit, obviously our trading arrangements have changed. Businesses are still getting used to that. And so that's going to be a sort of a big story over the coming years as we adjust to a very different trading arrangement to the one that we've had over the preceding sort of 30, 40 years. But for large countries, trade effects are often in the detail. When you see kind of stories about industries being affected by Brexit, for example, there'll be other industries that are relatively unaffected by it. On the whole, for a larger country like the UK and Scotland within the UK, trade effects. Most of the trade is within the same currency in the same country, and so it doesn't tend to be that disruptive overall. But it can have really long-term effects on where people invest and how people invest, and so actually it's quite difficult to foresee how that will pan out. And as it says there, just because you won't build a factory now, it doesn't mean that you close it down suddenly, because it's still got some value. You might decide to invest less in the future, but less so, but you're not going to suddenly turn it off now. And then on the migration side, over the last 20 years, really, we've had record levels of migration from across the EU and the non-EU. And in fact, the other week, the ONS announced that they probably previously underestimated the amount of immigration that they've been from the EU. Now, in the long run, this doesn't take anybody's jobs away because labour supply creates its own demand, but the availability of the labour reshapes the economy because it substitutes for some skills, it complements others. And as I was saying about the sort of the effect on the food production industry, the availability of migrant labour there has had real impacts on the use of sort of automation and technology because it's meant that it's become less necessary. And then there's an additional side of this story, which is over the past year, we know that some migrant workers have actually returned home because of COVID. And so how many of those will return now? All of a sudden, there's been this big shock after a period where we've been very used to having that situation. But to turn back to technology, this is a really interesting chart because it shows that for all that we talk here in the UK about automation, we're actually a relatively unautomated economy in terms of the advanced economies manufacturing sectors. You can see that so the dotted line there is the average across advanced economies, and this is robots in factories per 10,000 manufacturing employees. And back in 2016, it hasn't changed a lot since then. You can see that we're around the average for advanced economies. And you look at some of our competitor nations, I mean, Germany has around 6 times the level of automation, same with Japan, and obviously South Korea is way out on its own. But sort of France, which we might consider ourselves quite similar to, and Italy are far further ahead in terms of automation. So again, it's important to kind of not be sort of too taken in by the idea that we're all of a sudden going to see massive kind of substitution with robots. What we've done at Emsi is created some measures of technology risk, and we've done that using data on tasks that people do in different jobs. We've categorized them into these 3 brackets here. So you can see that we've got high risk tasks, which are things like admin and controlling machines and handling and moving objects. And then at the low risk end, we've got these very people-y skills like caring for others, guiding people, motivating people. And then these ones in the middle, which are kind of quite ambiguous in terms of how technology will affect them, things like analysing information, which computers can do some ways much faster, but find it difficult to do the more complex things, getting information in terms of going around and talking to people, communicating, some things computers can do, some things they can't. So by putting these tasks into different boxes and then estimating the amount of time spent on these different boxes for different roles, we can start to think about the effects of technology. And it's important to be clear that some of these tasks will be affected by technology in different ways. We have this idea of robots in factories, and that's fine, but it's not just that. If you look at the top left there, we've got modular construction, and so modern methods of construction allow us to replace people on building sites with machines making buildings in advance with people involved, and so it changes it there. If you look at that one in the middle at the top, the McDonald's checkout machines, they allow them to cut out staff by having us talk to a computer instead of a person, and actually partly that's automating it by putting the effort onto us, especially when the computer doesn't give the answer that you expect. On the right-hand side there, that's a photo of farms in the Netherlands. If you Google National Geographic and Netherlands farming, there's a fascinating article about how Holland has the most advanced farming sector in the world, way more productive than other countries. And those fields there are using light to massively increase the productivity they get from their crops. Then on the bottom left there, you've got another kind of machine, a virtual machine. Everlaw is a system that allows you to dump loads of documents into it, and it will do document reviews for lawyers. So you're pursuing a lawsuit and you've got 10,000 documents from the defendant dumped on you. Well, You used to have people going through each one. Now you can get a machine to do it for you. And the bottom right there is an Ocado warehouse, where those things that look like washing machines are actually robots that run along those areas below, dropping goods and services into crates. And so actually that's another way of automation. So automation comes in many different forms. And what we can see here is that we've plotted the sort of the share of work that's at high risk of being replaced by technology. And then on the top, on the vertical axis, we've got the sort of the growth in jobs between 2003 and 2018. And you can see that those that are less exposed are, generally speaking, more likely to have grown in terms of the number of jobs. So you've got computer programming, activities of head offices and management consultancy that have grown really well. And then you've got a lot of the manufacturing sectors, which are much easier to automate down at the bottom there. The real outlier here is remediation and waste management, which can to some degree be automated, but to some degree not, and has still grown really well, but that's been driven by regulatory requirements, of course. And so you can see that there is some effect in terms of automation changing job growth, but it's not quite so simple as that. There's lots of industries that could see a lot of automation that are still seeing jobs growth as well. So again, it's important to not just kind of assume that it can all be sort of automated very simply. There's a lot of things that can change in between now and then. And then on trade, this showed the sort of the change in goods imports from the countries that have really seen huge changes between the late 90s and the sort of the period up to Brexit. And you can see that actually some of these countries have just seen massive transformations in our trading relations with them. And Slovakia is still quite a small import source, but it used to be basically nothing before it joined the EU. And that's partly because it was in the EU, but also partly because it's transformed as an economy. The same with Poland. We used to import very little because of the legacy of communism in the Eastern Bloc. And then, of course, the big one is China there, which has seen 1,000% increase in its growth. And that's £40 billion worth of imports that were there in 2016 that weren't there before. So there are these huge changes that go on in trading relationships over time. And that's had a huge effect in terms of our economy. And again, a similar chart here to sort of look at the sort of the pattern of trade and the sort of the exposure to EU trade. And again, it's kind of the sort of the areas where we've seen the sort of the biggest import penetration from different industries have actually seen slower job growth. And in some ways, this is a stronger trend than we get with technology, whereas those industries are less exposed to import competition, have grown jobs more. Effectively, some of our manufacturing industries we've outsourced to other countries because we found their goods cheaper than producing them ourselves. And so you can see that there is this kind of shift that, although in many ways that can make us better off as a society, if you're one of the workers in the industry, it can quite badly affect your opportunity. And so it's there are trade-offs all the way down in terms of international trade. And then finally on immigration, this is the sort of the pattern of growth of the migrant workforce over the sort of the period from 2005 when we had the EU accession countries admitted. And you can see that in that period to about 2018 on this chart, you see about a sort of an 80% increase in the EU workforce compared to about a 5% increase from in the British national workforce. And so, a huge change in terms of migrant availability. And this chart, which is very confusing, but I will talk you through, it sort of just gives food for thought on this one, because on the bottom axis here we have the automation percentile. So this is every occupation in the economy ranked in terms of how automatable it is from the data that we've looked at there. And then on the y-axis it's how much these occupations have come to rely on migrant workers to staff them. And so at the bottom left quadrant here, we have those jobs that are difficult to automate, but also we've not relied on migrants that much. And so teachers are a good example here, where basically most teachers are still British nationals, and actually teaching as a job in schools is not something we're immediately going to automate. And I think we'd have done it in the past year to get away from homeschooling if we had. Then on the top left, you've got these jobs which are difficult to automate, but we have started to use migrants for a lot more in this country over the past 15, 20 years. And so you've got things like chefs there, care workers, receptionists are there, sales and business managers. And so these are all jobs that, the future should be bright in terms of demand. And the fact that we've been using migrants, you can understand, because it's a way of meeting demands for them. And the really interesting category are those at the top right, which are jobs that we've come to rely a lot on migrant workers to meet the demands for. So things like LGV drivers, storage roles in warehouses, cleaners and domestic, catering and bar staff, things like that. But actually, a lot of these jobs could be automated to some extent. And so it's one of those interesting questions that, first of all, does the availability of migrant labour avoid us automating? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? And also, if automation comes forward with greater force in the future, have we built a workforce, and are we building a workforce that all of a sudden is not needed anymore? And so, that's where the kind of the policy choice in terms of economic development comes in. And so to conclude what has been probably an overly long presentation, just to sum up, oil and gas has been exposed, but has recovered pretty well, actually. And health and government, which are real strengths of the Scottish economy, are relatively COVID-proof. And as global prospects brighten, the outlook should come along well. Fellows work well so far. This has certainly been the story across the UK. The overall unemployment rise has been limited in Scotland. It's now started to fall across the UK. The dark patch in that is for young people, especially 16 to 17-year-olds. But overall, it's been a lot less bad than we'd expected. The recent lockdown has been a long way from lockdown 1. The production sectors, construction, manufacturing, have carried on working much more this past 6 months than they did in this sort of the second quarter of last year. And the hospitality sector, of course, remains a worry. And it is important for Scotland because of the sort of the importance of the tourist trade. And a good summer really will be critical. So we're all going to hope that vaccination and the sort of the effects of the current lockdown hold up, and we can have a sort of a more normal summer. And then on those longer term trends, technology, trade and migration all have different impacts on performance, and they've all got their pros and cons in terms of the impacts that they have around them. Technology can be a threat and a promise. If your job is taken away from it, it's awful for you, but as a consumer, it means that we get things sort of better and cheaper and all of that. And so, but it's kind of how you balance those disruptions to the people whose jobs are affected with the sort of the benefits that we get from it. And it doesn't happen in isolation. As it says there, more migration can mean less trade or technology, and that might be good and bad all at the same time. And there are knock-on consequences all around. Brexit is going to change all these three in time, because obviously it's going to have an impact on trade. But then if we sort of buy fewer goods from some countries but more from others, then that will have impacts on where we invest in technology, and it will also have impact on the sort of the demand for labour and how that draws on migrant labour as well. And underlying all of that is that as business models change in response to these trends, so will the skills demands. And so the challenge is to anticipate those disruptions and what they'll look like in the workplace. And so at that point, I better shut up because I've probably spoken for a lot longer than I anticipated. So.
Thank you, Duncan, and a really great presentation, really. I think it's difficult sometimes to try and quantify what's happened in the last 12 months. But this is a fantastic session, really, that sort of gives us some ideas, particularly, like you say, around the strength of the Scottish economy, focusing around the health sector and some of the innovation in that. I also think as well there's opportunities there. So we've got our session, like I mentioned at the outset of this, we've got our session with Scottish FE leaders on coming up on Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, and we're going to be looking at opportunities. And I've made a note there, particularly around digital and IT. I know the Scottish government have recently announced that Scottish FE is going to be the anchor for the Scottish economy moving forward. So it'd be interesting to hear what Scottish leaders have got to say around areas for growth and areas for opportunity. But I just wanted to say thank you to Duncan. Really great presentation. I always love Duncan's presentation. How he always puts the health warning that it'll be a complicated slide, but then explains it so that it's not as complicated as when it first looks. So thank you for that, Duncan.
Right. Thank you.
And thank you, Duncan. And we've got no questions, but like Debbie said, obviously we will be sending copies of the presentation out and the recording to people that have registered. If anybody has any queries, it's the usual email, the info@Emsi email that we'll pick up as well. But I'd like to thank Duncan and like to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and I hope you have a really good rest of the day. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you.